In this video, you are going to master the Kmoch Variation under the Nimzo-Indian Defense with the black pieces, so let's start. So we are playing with the black pieces and white starts with 1d4. We play knight f6, c4, e6, and here white plays the move knight to c3. And from here the Nimzo-Indian begins. In the Nimzo-Indian we play the move bishop b4, and there is another move which is d5, which is also known as the Queen's Gambit decline. But I will always prefer the move bishop b4 because we are keeping the flexibility with the d pawn, whether to push the pawn to d5 or to keep the pawn to d7 or to even push the pawn to d6. So after bishop to b4, today we are going to discuss what happens if white continues with the move f3, which is also known as the Kmoch Variation. We already know that there are tons of variation under this particular system. There is e3, f3, queen c2, queen b3, a3, and many more, even knight c6, knight to f3. So after bishop b4, we are going to focus on f3 today. After f3, now there are two moves that are played heavily in the tournament games, d5 and c5. Today I'm going to recommend you to play the move c5 in this position. After c5, now there are four moves for white to continue the position. White can play the move d5, which is the main move. White can play the move e4, white can play the move e3, or white can even capture the pawn on c5. So first let's try to discuss what happens if white simply captures the pawn. We capture the pawn back with the bishop. White plays e4. The idea here is white wants to play e5, but here we can simply play the move knight to c6 in this position, and black is already very happy in this position. Because after knight c6, you can already sense black has already developed 3 of his pieces, whereas white has only developed 1 piece. White can never castle short because the bishop is already covering the g1 square. We just need to play short castle g5, and black is already better in this position. So going back, that's exactly what happens if white captures the pawn on c5. If white plays the move e3 in this position, trying to protect the pawn on d4, we can capture the pawn and play the move knight to c6 in this position. So after knight to c6, white is having 2 moves to continue the position. White can play the move d5 or even a3. If white tries to continue with d5, after d5 we can already capture the pawn and put our knight to e5, and black is already having a very interesting position. Black just needs to play short castle, rook e8. If something like we need to attacking the knight, you can still short castle because after takes rook e8 and white loses the queen. So that's the reason why black is already having a very comfortable position after d5. So if white tries to play the move a3 attacking the bishop, you can simply chop off the knight in this position and play the move b6. The idea is pretty clear. Black wants to play bishop a6, knight a5, rook e8, and pressure the c4 pawn, and black is already winning the game. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays e3, it's a bad move. If your opponent plays e4 in this position, after e4 trying to control the center, we can simply chop the pawn on d4, queen d4 and knight c6, attacking the queen, and after queen to e3, simply play the move d6 because after queen e3, white must be preparing to play the move e5, so we are playing the move d6, and black is already having a very happy position. Black can play the move short castle, bishop c5 attacking the queen followed by queen d6, and or even d5 in the future, breaking the position, opening up the position because the king is still in the center. So black is already having a very happy position, and you can already say that black is winning in this position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays e4. So coming to the main move, what happens if your opponent plays d5? After d5, going with the center, trying to grab as much space as possible by pushing the pawn to d5. After d5, we play the move b5 in this position. The b5 point is pretty clear. Our idea is to attack the c4 pawn. If white tries to capture the b5 pawn, we are going to capture the d5 pawn with the knight. Like takes, knight takes, and black is already better. So after b5, white is having 2 critical moves to continue the position. White can either play the move d into e6, or white can play the move e4 in this position. If white tries to continue with d into e6, after d into e6 we can play the move fe6, takes, and play the move d5. And after d5, you can already sense that black is a pawn down, but black is having a tremendous powerful center. d4 is coming in. So after d5, white is forced to play e3. You can simply capture the knight and play the move a6 in this position. And it's a very interesting position. It is basically similar to Benko Gambit, but we are having tons of tempos up because we have already pushed up onto d5, c5, e6. And after a6, white is having 2 ways. If white continues with e3, we can play the move first, c4, blocking the bishop on f1. And after takes, we can simply take with the knight. The idea is pretty clear. We want to play the move knight c5 followed by putting the knight to b3, and black is way better. And that's exactly what happens if e3. If your opponent simply captures the pawn, you can still play the move c4. The idea still remains the same. You want to capture the pawn on a6, knight c5, knight b3. So after e4, you can first castle, and the idea is still the same: knight a6, knight c5, knight b3, and black is already better. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent captures the pawn on e6. If your opponent plays the move e4, which is the main move, after e4 we first play the move d6. Now d6 is a very interesting move. In the past, there have been two common ways to continue the possession, which is first, you can either capture the pawn on c4, or you can first play the move short castle. But from 2019 Grand Prix onwards, when Magnus Carlsen played the move d6 in this particular position, then this particular move order started to become famous. Because after d6, the position is very interesting. First of all, after d6, you are trying to stop white's e5. And second, generally in such of setups with the b into c4 or short castle, white's usual idea would have been to play the move knight s3, knight f2, or knight to e2. So after d6, you are basically restricting white to play the move knight s3, because if white tries to play knight s3, we can already capture the pawn on d5, and after something like cd5 can take on h3, and after takes, white is already having a bad pawn structure. So basically, after d6, the knight h3 system is completely gone. So d6 is already a very interesting move. So after d6, white is having tons of moves that can be played in this position. White can play the move knight e2, which is the main move. White can play the move bishop to d3, a3, d into e6, cb5. So these are the tons of moves. First, let's start with what happens if cb5. After cb5, we simply take on d5, takes, and simply short castle. Our idea is pretty clear: we want to play rook e8 check. So after short castle, white continues with bishop d3. So after bishop d3, white's idea is to play the move short castle, knight e2 and short castle. So rook e8 is not the best, but we can first play the move a6 in this position. After a6, the idea is pretty clear: if white takes, we are going to take with the bishop, and we are going to have a happy position. So after a6, white tries to play the move knight e2 to castle as soon as possible. And once white short castle, white can claim that white is having the slight edge. But after knight e2, we can already play the move queen b6, which is a very strong move and logical move. After queen b6, white can no longer castle, because after c4, it's a check and white loses the bishop. So that's exactly what happens after queen b6. Now we are fully prepared to capture the pawn on b5, followed by capturing the pawn on d5, and we are going to retain our pawns and going to be better in this position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent captures the pawn on b5. If your opponent plays the move d into e6 in this position, after d6, you can first capture the pawn with the bishop, developing the piece. And here, if white tries to capture the pawn with the pawn, cb5, you can play the move b5 in this position, opening up the position, opening up the center. And after d5, if white tries to play a3, you can simply capture the knight, pawn takes, and here you can play the move knight to d7. The idea is pretty clear: you want to play short castle, rook e8. You are basically taking advantage of developing your pieces. If white takes, we are happy to capture with the bishop, takes, rook e8 is still the same threat, and black is already better. So going back, that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays a3. If your opponent captures the pawn on d5 first, now we are going to capture with the knight, and now the c3 is hanging. So white is forced to play bishop d2, and after bishop d2, white's idea is to already capture the knight on d5 and have a major trade. So first, we chop the knight on c3, and after pawn takes, we first castle, and black is already having a better position. Black can continue with rook e8, and something like bishop c4 is always met with queen h4, check, and simply capture the bishop. So you can already sense the position is already better for black, because black is way better in lead in development, and white's king is still in the center. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent captures the pawn on e6. Going back, what happens if your opponent plays the move a3 in this position, attacking the bishop. After a3, we play the move bishop to a5, pulling back the bishop. And after bishop a5, now white continues with bishop to d3, developing the bishop. Here we play the move short castle first. After short castle, white continues with knight to e2, developing the knight. And here we finally chop the pawn on c4, bishop into c4, and here we play the move bishop e6, a very interesting move. A very important thing to notice in this position: after bishop c4, if you try to capture the pawn in this position, bishop d5, knight d5, queen d5, bishop e6 is not really working, because after queen a8, queen b6, it looks like the queen is trapped after knight c6, but white is having a very strong move in the position, which is b4 in this position. And after b4, if you try to capture the pawn, already white can play the move knight to d5, attacking the queen. So after takes, queen takes, white queen is running away and white is winning the game. That's exactly what happens if we try to capture the pawn on d5 in this position. So that's the reason we first play bishop a6 in this position. After bishop a6, white takes, we take the bishop back, and here white short castle. And after short castle, we can already capture the pawn. And if knight takes, we can play the move knight takes, queen takes, knight c7, followed by d5, and black is having an equalish position. Whereas going back, if your opponent captures the pawn with the pawn in this position, we can play the move knight c7, and here the position is very comfortable for black. Black's idea is to play rook e8 and rook b8, taking two open files in control, and black is having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays e3. If your opponent plays the move bishop to d3 in the position, after bishop d3 trying to, this move looks pretty sensible logical because you are developing the bishop and trying to take control of the center, trying to protect the center. So after bishop d3, we first short castle in this position, and after short castle, knight e2, we try to capture the pawn on c4, bishop c4, and here already a very strong move, play the move knight into d5, sacrificing the knight. And after knight d5, the point is pretty clear. White cannot capture the knight with the pawn because after queen to h4 check, it's a check, the king is forced to move, and after queen c4, black is already winning because white's castle is broken up and the position is collapsing for white. So that's the reason after knight d5, white is forced to capture with the bishop. After bishop d5, we are going to take the bishop, queen takes, because if you try to capture with the pawn, it doesn't make any sense because after rook e8, I can already claim that black is having the bishop pair. Because of the d5 pawn, our d6 pawn is not really a big weakness. So after rook to e8, black is already having a very fine position. So going back, that's exactly why white is forced to capture the pawn with the queen. And after queen takes, we can play the move bishop to e7. The point is pretty clear. If white captures the rook, we can play the move queen b6. And now knight c6 is coming up, which can't really be stopped. So short castle, knight c6, takes, and like what's happening, black is already better in the position. So for example, something like knight f4, the threat is to play the move knight d5. So if we first chop off the knight, pawn takes, and after pawn takes, we can play the move bishop c4, attacking the rook. Rook moves, already knight to e5, protecting the d6 pawn, and the position is already interesting, very interesting I would say. Something like bishop d2 is met with queen to b2, putting pressure on the pawn on a2, and the position is very interesting, but I would say black is the only one that can push for a win. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent captures the rook on a8. If your opponent simply falls back with the queen, you can already play the move d5, opening up the center, takes, bishop d5, and after a3 you can already chop off the knight, play queen h4 check, g3, queen e7 check, and play bishop e6, trying to keep the queens on the board, and black is already better because of the bad pawn structure white is having, followed by knight c6, knight d4 coming up, and black is already better. So that's how you can continue this position. That's exactly what happens if your opponent plays bishop d3, which makes sense. Coming to the main move, what happens if your opponent plays knight to e2? From here, the real fun begins. After knight to e2, we are first going to chop the pawn on c4. And here, if white plays the move knight to g3, we can already chop the pawn on d5, e5, followed by short castle. And after bishop c4, rook e8 check, knight e2, already bishop into knight. A very interesting idea. White is forced to capture the bishop with the pawn, and now simply knight d7, followed by knight b6 is coming up and capturing the pawn. For example, something like short castle, we can play the move knight b6, bishop b3, protecting the pawn, and already we can play the move c4 and capturing the pawn on d5, and black is already better. That's exactly what happens at knight g3. So that's the reason knight f4 is the main move. We play the move e5, taking the knight back, and now we play the move knight d7. The point here is, if the knight g3 is the main move, but if still white tries to play the move d4, which kind of makes sense, white's idea here is, white is trying to push the pawns on the king's side because white has not really castled yet, and now white's idea is to play the move knight g3. So first grabbing space on the king's side and then only play the move knight to g3. So after g4, we first play the move h5, attacking the pawn, g5, knight h7. Now the g5 pawn is hanging, so white is forced to play the move h4, defending the pawn, and now we can play the move knight to b6, knight to g3, and now first playing g6, protecting the pawn and at the same time covering the f5 square from the knight. So after g6, f4 trying to open up the position, we can happily capture the pawn and play the move short castle. And after short castle, black's already very much better because black's idea is to play the move f6, opening up the position. White's king is going to remain in the center. Long castle is not possible, short castle is not possible. We are going to open up the center and black is already better. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays g4, which is not the best. The main line is to continue with knight g3. After knight g3, we are going to play the move knight b6. And after knight b6, the main move is to continue with bishop e2. But if white continues with the side line, which is f4, we can first capture the pawn, but after bishop f4, simply queen e7. And the position is already lost for white because the e4 pawn is collapsing. And knight to d5 is also coming up because the e pawn is pinned up. So you're going to win a pawn and eventually win the game. So that's exactly what happens if f4. If your opponent plays the move bishop e2, which is the main move, here we are going to play the move, a very strong move, knight to g8. Now what's happening? Does black gone insane? What's happening? The basic point of playing knight g8 in this position here is, if we try to short castle in this position, white's idea is to play the move short castle. And once if we try to play something like, let's say bishop a5, white's idea is to play the move f4, takes, followed by bishop g5 and pinning this knight, which is very irritating pin. So that's the reason, at the place of short castling first, we are first putting the knight to g8. And now the idea here is, we want to put our knight to e7, followed by some f5 threats in the future, or even knight g6, knight f4 could be a potential idea. So after knight g8, now white's having 4 critical moves continuing the position. White can play the move queen c2, h4 in this position, f4, or even short castle in the position. If white tries to continue with what happens if short castle, which makes sense. After short castle, we are going to play the move knight e7, continuing the development. Now, if white tries to play the move something like f4, opening up the position, we can chop the pawn. And if bishop takes, we can play the move knight g6, attacking the bishop. And here, bishop falls back and we can already short castle in the position. And after short castle, we are a pawn up and having a healthy position. The e4 pawn could be a target in the future. The position is roundabout even, I would say, and there is no particular weakness. The e5 square belongs to the knight, and I don't see any particular way that white can trouble black in this position, and the position should be comfortable for black. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays f4. Now let's try to discuss what happens if white continues with rook to e1. After rook e1, we are going to play simply short castle, knight f1. The idea is to maneuver the knight to e3 and try to capture the pawn on c4. But here we can already play the move f5, knight e3, and simply play the move f4, pushing up the pawn. We can give a pawn back, but already g5 and black is in complete control. I don't see any reason to deny to play the move h5 g4, and we can simply start playing on the king side, and there is no way white can try to interfere black's attack on the king side, and black is already better. So going back, that's exactly what happens if white short castle in the position. If white tries to play a move like f4, we can already capture the pawn, bishop takes, and knight to e7. Our idea is pretty simple, we want to play knight g6. So if knight h5, we first castle, queen e2, and play the move knight g6. And after knight g6, our idea is pretty simple, we want to capture the bishop, which is a very powerful piece. Bishop h6. Now what are you going to do? Bishop h6, the idea is pretty clear. If takes, white is going to take, and it's a force mate on g7. So you can't really take. So after bishop to h6, there is the only single move that helps black to keep a slight advantage. What is the move? You can try to pause and find the move. Bishop g4 is the move. If you want this move, kudos to you. You can pack on your back, because after bishop g4, the idea is pretty simple. You are attacking the knight and the bishop. So after bishop g4, you can simply give a check and already f5. And now the question is, who is attacking who? Because if pawn takes, you can capture the bishop. The pawn cannot capture the knight because the king is hanging and the position is falling apart. And if you try to capture with the bishop, I can simply capture the knight, and black is already having a very better position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move bishop into g4. If your opponent plays something like bishop g7, capturing the pawn, you can simply chop off the knight, takes, and after takes, black is having 2 minor pieces for a rook, which is winning position for black. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays f4 in this position. So now we're discussing what happens if your opponent plays h4, which is a very interesting move. After h4, what's the idea? After h4, white is saying that I know black's idea is to play the move knight e7 followed by knight g6. So the moment black is going to play knight e7, white is going to play the move h5, stopping white from knight g6, which looks pretty sensible. So after h4, we are going to first play the move f5, already striking in the center. After f5, now white plays the move f4 because the idea is pretty simple. If white tries to capture the pawn, we are going to play the move knight e7 and we are going to win back at least a pawn. So that's the reason f4 is the best move, trying to create some complications in the center, opening up the position. After f4, we are going to play the move first, bishop into knight takes, and now knight to f6, putting pressure to capture the pawn on e4. White castle, we also castle. The position remains the same. And after short castle, white takes, and he can already play the move d into e5. And once white captures the pawn, we can take on d5 in this position. Bishop f3, attacking the queen and the rook. We can trade off the queen and put our rook to b8. And the position is that black is having an extra pawn. Black c3 pawn is weak, and indeed black is having the bishop compensation, but still the position remains the same and there is no difficulty for black in this position. Black can play the move bishop d7 and live a happy life. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move h4. Now coming to the main move, what happens if your opponent plays queen to c2. After queen c2, we are going to play the move knight e7 in the position. Our idea is pretty clear. Short castle, a5, a4. And white's idea is to play the move a5, attacking the knight. So at the place of playing a5 by ourselves, we can first play the move bishop a5, which also acts as a guard to stop the pawn from pushing to a5. And after bishop a5, knight to b5, we can play the move knight to g6. And black is already having a very comfortable position. Black can play the move knight to f4 or even knight h4 followed by f5. And there is no way black is having any particular position, any trouble in this position, and black is having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly how you can play this Kmoch variation under the Nimzo-Indian Defense. So if you learned anything new today, make sure to like the video, share this video with everyone, and make sure to subscribe to our channel if you are new to our channel. So you have successfully mastered today the Kmoch variation under the Nimzo-Indian Defense. So thank you for watching and stay tuned, and bye bye.